Welcome, everyone, to another edition of The Travel Show with your host, Ted Blank of Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventure. And as we like to do, we talk about all things travel. And I'm excited to chat it up with Ted about our topic today. How have you been, Ted Blank?
I've been doing pretty well, thank you.
Well, good. What's new in your world?
You know, I am at the point now where I'm just done with winter. I'm ready for spring. I'm ready for flowers. I'm ready to move on.
Excellent. Spring is one of my favorite seasons, if not my favorite season, because I think you and I have talked before. There's a newness to it, and there is, I don't know, it's like the cycle of life starts over again where little things, you know, and it's a time of hope and all those good things. And well, I'm excited to hear what we're going to talk about today. Does it have to do with hope?
Well, I don't know if I would take it that far, but
okay.
I thought we could talk a little bit about some of my tips and some of the ways I help folks choose the perfect stateroom for themselves on a cruise.
Oh, wow. So you have some tips behind the scenes. I love to hear this.
I do. So I should say sometimes, there are a lot of different terms we might use interchangeably for the place you sleep on a ship. Some people call them cabins. Some people call them staterooms. On some ships, they maybe have suites or they only have suites. So there are a lot of different terms. But basically, the stateroom is the place you lie your head down at night and sleep when you're taking a cruise. And in the old days, back in the good old days, it used to seem a lot simpler. Cruise ships have always had a couple different types of staterooms available. They have always had staterooms that are kind of in the center of the ship and don't have windows. And those tend to be small staterooms, very much geared towards folks who are on a very tight budget or geared towards folks who are traveling alone for single travelers. And then when I took my first cruise, your other choice was a cabin that had a window or a stateroom that had a window. And that's called an outside cabin, meaning it has a window. And that was pretty much it. There were definitely suites, but those are really your two choices. And the only differences between them were maybe the size and where they were located on the ship. And then in the 80s and the 90s, cruise ships started to add a new category of stateroom called the balcony stateroom. And the balcony stateroom basically swept the world and took over the world. And in fact, there are some cruise ships that are built today that don't have outside staterooms anymore. They don't have cabins with windows. Every stateroom has a balcony. And of course, the size of the balcony depends on the size of the stateroom. The location of the stateroom on the ship can make a difference. And now there are actually even balconies that are sort of like a Four Seasons room where you can press a button and the window slides up and all of a sudden you have an open air balcony there. Or if it's a little cooler, you can press a button and the window slides down and you have an enclosed balcony that still looks out the side of the ship, has a nice floor to ceiling window, but it's only indoor outdoor as you choose. So there's really been a big evolution in this addition of the balcony stateroom. And then suites. And, again, back in the day, there were usually a couple suites on ships. And now many cruise lines have private enclaves that are only composed of suites, where you get a whole bunch of additional benefits that come along with those suite staterooms. And suites can be smaller and they can be bigger. And on some ships, the suites are immense. They might have a full dining room. They might have a grand piano. And, a lot of times people will ask me the question, well, who books these suites? And certainly there's some people who that's just kind of the lifestyle they're accustomed to. But a lot of folks really like to entertain. And maybe they're traveling with their family. Maybe they are traveling with a group and they want to have a place to be able to entertain their family and friends. And so a suite can be a great option for them as well.
I guess I never thought about that. You could have everyone over to your room. And if you had a grand piano, you could sit around and sing show tunes, right?
You could do that. You could go around singing show tunes. A lot of them will serve you dinner there. You could have appetizers. You can have drinks. When you have that big of a stateroom, you're going to have a huge balcony, so you can sit outside and watch the sunset or watch the scenery go by. So you can do whatever strikes your mood. I guess if it's singing show tunes, you could do that.
It's always singing show tunes, Ted Blank, all night long. I love show tunes. So, Ted, this is really unique because I guess I never thought about how far cruise ships have really come in a relatively short amount of time, 30, 40 years, something like that.
Yeah, and what's really changed too is that back in the day, there might be maybe 10 different categories of staterooms that you could choose from. And some ships now have 20, 30, 40 even types of staterooms. So there are a lot of variations between the staterooms and between the way they're priced. And so, it's something that folks who are thinking about taking a cruise, even on a smaller ship, even on maybe a river cruise ship that does only have a couple categories of stateroom, it's often something that people are really confused by, and they don't even know where to start when they look at a cruise. And a lot of times, you'll see a price and it might be a price advertised online, and then you start to investigate a little bit and all of a sudden the price is doubled. And folks don't understand what's happening and why that's happening. And a lot of that has to do with the stateroom that's being selected and the way that stateroom is priced.
Well, let's dig into it then, please. How can you help us find the perfect stateroom?
Yeah, so I think, probably a couple tips that I just kind of keep in the back of my mind when I'm helping folks pick a stateroom. The first one is, is this a cruise where the side of the ship you're going to be on is going to make a difference? And so very often, and particularly in Alaska, folks will say, I would like to be on the side of the ship where I can look out of my stateroom and see the shore. And that's a really very logical request that people make. Now, the good news in Alaska is it actually doesn't matter which side of the ship you're on, because anytime you're close enough to shore where it's going to matter, there will be scenery on both sides. And in a lot of cases, you go in somewhere, turn around, and come back out. So, I think that's something that people really are very nervous about, being on the correct side of the ship. But in a lot of cases, it doesn't really make that much difference. But that's something that I always kind of start to think about first with a cruise. Does it matter which side of the ship you want to be on? And then I'll often have a conversation with folks about how they use their stateroom. And some folks literally get up in the morning, leave, and they don't come back until it's time for bed. And so they might be interested in a less spacious stateroom. They might want a smaller stateroom, not as concerned about where it's located. Other people, though, and I think this is pretty common, a lot of people spend a fair amount of time in their stateroom. Even though there's a lot to do on the ship, they might go back, they might want to watch TV. Maybe before they go to bed, the husband likes to read and the wife likes to sit outside and, have a glass of wine. And so having space to spread out is really important. And so that's one of the things we'll have a conversation about. How are you going to use the stateroom? Bathrooms are important. Generally speaking, the smaller the stateroom, the smaller the bathroom. And if you have 2 or 3 people in a stateroom, you might want to look for a stateroom that has a larger bathroom so that you can have a little more room to spread out. A couple cruise ships even have bathrooms that have 2 sinks, just kind of like a lot of people do at home. So don't have to share a sink with your traveling companion. Other things that are really important to talk about are mobility in particular. And so, if a stateroom can be found relatively close to an elevator, that can very much reduce the amount of time and distance people have to walk to get around the ship. There are a lot of inconveniences on cruise ships, just like on hotels. In a hotel, you generally don't want to have the room right next to the elevator or right next to the ice machine, because sure enough, the instant you turn off the lights and go to bed, somebody's going to go to the ice machine and make a big commotion. So not being located across the hall from the laundromat can be a really important thing. And I really always look at the deck plan, which is really the floor plan for the ship, and look to see, what's above you, what's below you. If you're underneath the disco, you might have a lot of noise in the evening. If you're underneath the top deck of a ship, you're as tall as you can be except for the outdoor pools and stuff. A lot of people get up early in the morning and go for a walk or go for a jog. And so that can disturb your rest. So it's kind of, thinking about some of those little inconveniences that are out there and trying to, locate a stateroom that's not going to have a lot of those inconveniences. And it is interesting because, most cruise ships allow you to select your stateroom when you book your trip. But yet I've never found a resort that will let you do that when you book a vacation at a resort. So you do have some, additional control over where you spend the night on a cruise ship versus on a land resort.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, it's just a difference between those types of vacation. And there are inconveniences in hotels as well. But I think, having a conversation with my clients is something I do just to get a sense of them. And people who haven't been on a cruise before, sometimes it can be a challenge to have that conversation because they don't even necessarily know the questions to ask. So that's something we kind of try to do proactively with people.
And I would assume every ship is different. First, you have to figure out what kind of a cruise they're going to go on, and then from there, pick the stateroom.
Yeah, and even ships within the same cruise line can be different. Older ships, newer ships, they can have very different layouts, very different types of accommodations. On the one hand, cruise ship cabins are getting better. But on the other hand, just like in hotels, they're getting a little more efficient with the use of space. And so sometimes the space can be a little bit constrained. I personally really enjoy staterooms that are on the back of the ship. So I have a nice panoramic view of the area behind the ship. But if you're a little susceptible to motion, that's probably not the best place to be. And that's, probably the final consideration when you think about where to position your stateroom on the ship is motion, because cruise ships do move. And so, if you hold a pencil with your fingers and kind of move it up and down, you can see that the middle of the pencil doesn't move very much, but the front, the tip of the pencil and the eraser move quite a bit. And so when a cruise ship moves, it tends to rock front to back. And therefore, the closer you are to the center of the ship, the less motion you're going to experience. Now, overall, cruise ships don't have much motion, and most people don't notice it, but some people are susceptible to that. And so it's important just to kind of think that through as well.
That's another good point as well. Thank you. Yes. And then the view, I think a lot of times can make or break. I mean, you might want to be in the middle of the ship because that is where there's less motion, but maybe your balcony overlooks the lifeboats, and that can be.
Yep. And there are balconies there are going to be cabins, even with balconies that have obstructed views. And so again, to have us help kind of, negotiate through all the differences, when there are 30 or 40 different levels of cabins on a ship, it is really, really hard to know the difference. And, even me, and I would consider myself an expert in this, I get out the deck plan and I look through it and I look at the stateroom and I kind of have a little algorithm I go through in my head to make sure we're picking the right stateroom. Now, sometimes there aren't a lot of choices available. And particularly when people make bookings a little closer in to travel time, there may not be the stateroom they want available. In Alaska, the first cabins that are going to sell out are the ones that are on the side of the ship that's going to be close to land when the ship is out in the ocean. And even though you don't really have a view from there, people are convinced that that's what they want. And so those staterooms go first. So oftentimes, if you're someone who is particular about the stateroom and the location, the earlier you book, the more choices you will have. And by the same token, if you're looking for some of those really low priced, best value staterooms, or the suites at the top of the ship, those are the ones that are going to sell out first as well.
Well, that's interesting that they would be such a wide range and they sell out the most quickly.
Yep. And keep in mind too, with suites and things like that, there are far, far fewer of them on board ships than there are the regular staterooms. So, even a big cruise ship going to Alaska that might have 1,200 cabins or something like that might only have 30 suites. And so once they're gone, they're gone. Usually you can find a balcony stateroom, but, again, it might not be in the place that you'd ideally like it to be, or it might be the one that's across from the laundromat, which isn't the place to be.
So, Ted, on each cruise ship that you've been on, is it universal what your favorite stateroom is, or does it change kind of by what kind of a cruise ship you're on?
I would say when I've been on a cruise ship a couple times, I have a definite favorite. I really do like the staterooms that are on the back or the stern of the ship and have a view out the back. I think that's really, really, to me, one of the nicest views you can have on a cruise ship. Otherwise, I'm pretty flexible when it comes to staterooms. I really do like having a balcony. It's nice to be able to get a little bit of fresh air, step outside. If somebody else is changing, you can leave a little space for them to, use the cruise ship space up, because the cruise ship cabins are smaller than hotel rooms. So if one person's changing, the other person probably wants to kind of get out of the way. And I just enjoy, getting up in the morning and going out on the balcony and having a cup of coffee. But, if it's on deck 7 or deck 14, I'm pretty flexible when it comes to that. But I definitely like those staterooms that are on the back of the ship.
Well, that's interesting. And how about seasickness for you? Do you get motion sickness?
I don't. I'm pretty fortunate. I don't get motion sick at all. And actually, most people don't get motion sick. I think some people are nervous that they will, but they don't actually do it. One of the best solutions to motion sickness are the little wristbands that you can buy, at a pharmacy or a big box store that have a little tiny pressure point, and you put them on your wrist and it kind of presses on your pulse point. And for most people, that's a non-medical, you don't have to wear a patch, you don't have to take a pill. That helps a lot of people who have a little bit of motion sickness or even are just a little bit nervous about motion sickness. Most people find that that's sufficient for what they need. There are people who do get pretty motion sick. And so in that case, the patch or one of the motion sickness pills might be your best bet.
So, as far as picking the perfect stateroom, let's say you're traveling with a big group, you don't necessarily want to all stay together in a suite, but would you recommend, or is it hard to get rooms near each other?
It depends. The earlier you book, the more choice you're going to have, the more options for rooms close to each other. On a lot of cruise ships, they can actually open up the balconies between the staterooms. So if you want to have a larger balcony where everybody can get together kind of socially, if your cabins are all next to each other, you can do that. There are adjoining cabins, where you can open the door between them. And sometimes for families, that can be a great solution. Other families, mom and dad like to pick a balcony stateroom on the ship, and we like to find an inside stateroom for the kids that's right across the hall from them. So there are a lot of different options to do it, and it just depends on how you travel and then kind of what you're looking for. Again, when you have a special request like that, that's when you really want to book early so you have the opportunity to make the best selection and also to compare. It might make more sense to, instead of buying those 2 staterooms, do a suite that has 2 bedrooms instead, and you might actually have a much, much better experience, and the price difference might not be all that great either.
Well, you know what, Ted, it would really behoove us, wouldn't it, to sit down with you or someone from your team to learn more, but then also to help with some of these decisions. How could we do that?
Yeah, the best way to get a hold of us is to give me a call at 651-964-8245. You can visit my website, tedblanktravel.com, or our office in downtown Hudson at 206 Locust Street is open Monday through Thursday from 10 to 2 for walk-ins, or just give us a call and we can make an appointment with you, sit down and talk through all the details of cruising or whatever vacation it is you're looking to take.
Making our dreams come true, Ted Blank. He is the host of The Travel Show. He is also the owner of Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventure, and you are listening to AM 1460 and FM 97.7 KDWA in Hastings. This travel show has been brought to you by Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventures.